Hey guys, happy Wednesday. All right, let's go ahead and get this all wrapped up for the week. So remember, we're still talking about Reconstruction times in Alabama after the Civil War. So what do we do now? So even though the Civil War brought freedom to those that had been slaves for so long, a lot of African Americans were still without work and without a place to live. Because you got to think, they worked on the plantations and they also lived on the plantations. It's not like they went to work on the plantations and then went home. They lived on the plantations as well. Some European Americans tried to get them to come back to work on the plantations, even though they were free. So it was a big problem because there was nowhere that would really hire just freed slaves for work to pay them. So the people who owned the plantations were trying to get them to come back and work on the plantations, even though they had just kind of left that environment. After a while, however, some African Americans didn't have a choice and they did end up going back to work on the plantations, but not as slaves. They actually got to be employees and were paid a share of the money that the plantation made on its crops. Now, was it a big share? Probably not, but it was more than they had ever made before because they weren't ever getting paid. This was referred to as sharecropping. So here's a picture of just some just freed slaves harvesting the crops in the plantation farms, and they were getting paid for this. This was just one of the ways that former slaves made a living after the war. So 14 for freedom. In the year 1868, the U.S. Constitution was amended or changed. Amended means changed. It was changed to include citizenship, liberty, and rights for all people, whether they were African American or white. So that was huge, huge amendment in the Constitution. Amending the Constitution, period, was a really big deal. And this was only the 14th time it had ever happened. So that's why it's also referred to as the 14th Amendment. It took many generations before African Americans were actually treated as equals, and we know that just by studying and knowing about the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King Jr. and all that stuff. We know that the 14th Amendment didn't mean that everything changed for the better right then and there, but it was definitely a big step in the right direction. So this was a key moment in our history for all of those who had once been slaves. So did African Americans actually become wealthy after the war? They were allowed to work now, so did they become wealthy? Well, the Civil War didn't make people wealthy, especially in the South. So people in the South in general after the Civil War weren't wealthy because they had lost so much during the war, but former slaves were no exception to this rule, and they often found making their way in the world as free people really difficult. Like I said, a lot of people weren't going to be hiring former slaves to actually pay them, and a lot of them did go back to work on the plantations that they had just come from, even though they were getting paid. There were exceptions, of course. Sarah Breedlove was one of those exceptions. Sarah Breedlove is also known as Madam C.J. Walker, and she grew a cosmetics business in the days of the Reconstruction. Okay, she started Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, and it did like cosmetics and hair care and all of that stuff. And so she started to sell her products door to door and slowly built her company into an amazingly wealthy one. So always an exception to every rule. And this just goes to show you that if you work really hard for something you want, there's nothing you can't achieve. All right, guys, that is going to wrap it up for this week. Make sure you're checking your folders daily, completing your work daily so you don't get behind. Remember, if you were in class, you'd be doing all this work in a day, and then you wouldn't get a chance to do it 3 days later or a week later. Okay, so make sure we're keeping up with all of our work. All right. All right, guys, have a great rest of your day and a great rest of the week, and I will see you next week.